Hey friends, and welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is yet another Before You Read lecture on the book of Ezekiel. Here we are focusing on the third major section of Ezekiel, chapters 33 through 39. And this is a kind of a hodgepodge, really, of material over two major topics, or two major themes, we might say. The first are oracles of restoration, promises of what the future will look like, promises of what God is going to do with the mess and the destruction and the desolation of the Babylonian Empire. So that's the first major thing in these chapters. And the second are, there's scattered within these chapters are additional oracles against the nations, additional words of judgment, words of warning to those surrounding nations. This section of Ezekiel, I suspect, also holds at least two of the most famous parts of Ezekiel. One of those is the word against the shepherds in chapter 34. And I think the reason this is important or well known is, of course, what Jesus says about himself in the New Testament, in the Gospel of John, about the good shepherd. And so we hear in chapter 34 a word of judgment against the bad shepherds and their negative characteristics. And then we hear a description of God as the true shepherd. And I think that this is a wonderful place for us to sort of pause and to sit with this chapter for a little bit and think about leadership and think about what God offers us. And in comparison to other shepherds, other things that might guide or direct or direct our ways. I think that there's an opportunity for us to think about that in an analogical way. So we may not have kings in the way that ancient Israel did, and maybe it's not even our political leaders that have the same sort of sway that these bad shepherds do. But maybe it's other things that direct our time or direct our attention or direct some aspect of our lives. The second, I think probably famous or well-known part of Ezekiel 33 through 39 is the Valley of Dry Bones in chapter 37. I think that this is one of those stories that we teach in our kids' Sunday school classes. It's memorable, it's elaborate, and it's a beautiful story. And so it's something I think to sit with. Along with these two incidents that are, I think, pretty famous, we have another set of diverse material that it's kind of hard to provide an outline. It's hard to say how it all holds together. And at the end, in chapters 38 and 39, we've got this really, really strange story about Gog and the Gog of Magog, which it's almost as though it's coded language. We're not quite sure what to do with it. So I'll be interested to hear your thoughts about it. I want to suggest that one of the key questions of this section of Ezekiel can be found in verse 33, where the people of Israel are said to say, "How then can we live?" How can we live? That, I think, is the central question in these chapters that are describing restoration and renewal in the midst and in the reality of desolation and destruction. How then can we live? That's the central question. How can we move on after this traumatic event? How can we move forward after the Babylonian exile, after the loss of our expectations, after the shattering of our hope? How then can we live? That in 33 is a central question, and I would suggest it's a central question throughout. And many of the images and the descriptions of restoration that we find in these chapters, I think, are connected to life, connected to that question, how can we live? And so we won't be surprised that these promises and images of restoration are going to include verdant pastures and water and cleansing and the sort of the fruitfulness and the flowering of creation. God's restoration in Ezekiel 39 or 33 through 39 is all about what makes for living, what makes it possible for this people of Israel to live again. And I think that's right where we fit in the chapter 37 in the valley of dry bones. What else is that image except, what else is that story except a sort of a dramatic representation, a dramatic answer to Israel's question in 33, how then can we live? The answer of 37, spoiler alert, is only by the action of God, only by the inbreathing of God's Spirit, only with the reversing of the course of history can Israel live. This is a rich section of Ezekiel. I suggest, I imagine that this will be a little bit easier, a little bit more familiar for you as you read. And so I would suggest a couple of things for you to be on the lookout as you read. The first, as was similar with the oracles against the nations, pay attention to the images related to wrath and mercy, to judgment and promise of salvation, to desolation and renewal. The theme of reversal is really important in these chapters. So how do you see the images and the descriptions of these two poles playing against one another? Wrath and desolation on the one side, and mercy and renewal on the other. A second thing that you might pay attention to in these chapters has to do with the expectation, the hope for a new king and a united kingdom. If you've been in this group for a while, you'll remember that in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, God sort of reluctantly gives in to the people's request for a king. Initially, God wants to be the king of the people, but the people want to be like all the surrounding nations. And so God kind of throws up his hands and says, okay, fine, you can have a king. They're going to be nasty. They're going to take all your stuff. They're going to be unjust, but that's what you want. You got it. Ezekiel, I think, subverts or at least interprets that story, that sensibility, by giving voice to the people's longing for a king, a just king, a king that is modeled after or likened to God, the shepherd of Israel. And so where do you see the threads of hope, the threads of expectation for a new king or a new kingdom? I think the technical term for this is messianic expectations. Where do you see those, and why might those be important? And then the third thing to look for is a question that I asked in the last Before You Read lecture, which is, again, what does all of this have to do with us? I think the question, how then can we live, is a perennial question. We may not be facing the destruction of exile. We may not be facing a change of government, but we might be facing our own deaths. We might be asking ourselves, how then can we live after that diagnosis, after that loss of relationship, after the disappointment, after the death of someone we love? How then can we live? Well, friends, I hope that this Before You Read lecture has given you a brief orientation to Ezekiel 33 through 39. I hope it's given you some food for thought, and I hope that it will guide and inform your own reading and engagement with this material. I look forward to hearing your thoughts about it, but for now, happy reading.